White Noise, Chapter 2, Triangle of Hate. Section 1, Unexpected Guest. The following morning, Anne awoke to aggressive pounding on her door. Violet burst through, ran in the center of Anne's room, and squawked, "Phone for you!" Anne's eyes opened wide through sleepy fog. Violet reared back and threw the phone at Anne at full force. The phone flew and smacked Anne with a hard thud. Sharp pain branched throughout the side of her face from her temple. She curled up in the covers and screamed, "Why?" Violet was already slamming Anne's door behind her. A throbbing, dull pain rose after the initial sharpness subsided. While trying to ignore the pain, she felt around for the phone in the covers. "Hello?" She yawned. She laid back down on her pillow and began to stretch out, feeling that sweet morning CO2 popping in her joints. "Hey, can I come over?" Sebastian asked. Normally, Sebastian was the one who slept late. This made her wonder what time it was, or even if it was still morning at all. Seeing the light that entered in the room, her blinds at the window, it appeared it was at least past 9 a.m. I guess you're up early, aren't you?" "Yep, and cool. I'm in your driveway now." He laughed. Anne could hear his mom in the background scolding him for not telling her that Anne didn't even know they were coming.
She didn't even know.
Give me a minute. I just woke up and I need to get dressed. I'll be right down. Anne wondered why he wanted to come over and why he had already come without even asking. It was like his confidence knew no bounds. Though he was a little rude, she was still rather excited to have his company. There was a short sting of hurt in her lingering feelings for him. Nevertheless, she took what he offered. She set the phone down on her nightstand and gathered her pajama pants off the floor, placing one stiff leg through, then the other in the black and white plaid jammies. When she took a quick look in the mirror to make sure that her eyes were free of sleep and she hadn't slobbered on herself, she noticed that her temple was a bright red. She opened her bedroom door and walked across the hall to her parents' room, where their door was shut, and gently knocked. "Hey, I have unexpected company. I'm sorry," Anne called through the door. Anne waited a moment before her mom answered.
"Okay."
She passed Violet's room on the right, where she could hear MTV playing on the TV behind the closed door. This was mainly what Violet did nowadays. Anne then heard faintly as she walked past, "Hi, this is Steve-O. Don't try this at home, and welcome to Jackass." She arrived at the stairs to the foyer and opened the front door to Sebastian's face looking down on her. Sebastian's mother, Paula, backed out of the driveway in her four-screen Trailblazer, then gunned it down the road like a bat out of hell, as she always did. Paula's driving scared Anne. When Anne had ridden with her in the past, she was sure on more than one occasion that they could count that they were going to swerve off the road and surely die. Paula would drive down the winding country roads reaching 85 miles an hour, where normally the speed limit was 45. Anne never felt safe in Paula's vehicle, but Sebastian thought nothing of it. Sebastian made a brief wave and pushed his way into the house. He headed up the stairs and straight for the fridge. Grabbing a pop from the door, he slammed it shut as he turned down the hallway and into her room. She made her way back up the stairs and followed him. He sat down in the beanbag chair she had at the foot of her bed in front of the TV that he had already turned on and the gaming station. Sebastian leaned back in the chair, spreading his legs and kicking his feet up on the cubbies of the entertainment center. Dried mud fell from the bottom of his shoes. He held the wired controller in one hand while he took several large gulps of pop, then belched. "Just make yourself at home." She got on her bed and laid down on her stomach to face the TV. "Oh, I am," he responded without turning to her. "Thanks." He began playing for quite some time before either of them spoke. She watched him heading out of a cave that he had last saved in and into another loading screen that remained on the screen for nearly a minute before leading him to the outside world surrounded by trees and foliage. "Why don't you go out with him?" Sebastian asked, breaking the silence. Anne sat up in bed, crossed her legs, then settled down by slumping over and continued to watch him play the game. "Why would I? I don't really know the guy." "Is this all he came over for? To to use my console and talk to me about dating his best friend? Because he likes you, Anne. I got my eyes set on this other girl at school. Anne was glad that he was facing the game when he had said this, because an arrow shot right through her heart and tore a hole right through to the other side. Really? You come over to my house and do this to me? You really are an asshole. Who? Anne asked. She tried to make sure that it came out sounding like pure curiosity. Astrid. I think she's in your third period class. I've been talking to her for a while now, and I'm going to ask her out on Monday, he said with little interest in his voice. He began mashing buttons on the controller when a gang of gnomes came into view and began beating his character to death. She blankly watched him play while considering this new situation. She's a lot like you, he mentioned blandly. You guys should be friends. This time he glanced around at Anne, but her face was wiped of emotion before he met eyes with her. He returned back to his game, and they spoke no further about the subject for the rest of the day. He mainly played video games until his mom returned to pick him up. She waved goodbye to them both and returned back inside, retiring to her room. She sat down with her back against the closet door while she stared at the bedroom and thought the whole thing over. I only met him over the summer. It's just a crush. I'll be fine. I can get over this. We weren't together that long anyway. Besides, I don't need him, she thought begrudgingly. Who is she anyways? I don't remember seeing her, though I remember them calling her name when taking roll. What does she look like? What is she like? He said that she was a lot like me, but how? If we're so similar, why does he like her and not me? Chapter 2, Section 2. A girl named Astrid. Anne sat in her third period class thinking of the girl with medium brown, shoulder-length hair, glasses, classic green eyes, and wore clothes that Anne liked that went by the name of Astrid. After school, Anne made her way back to the east wing doors of the school when she spotted Fat in the usual spot he always seemed to be. Rather than shying away from him, this time she approached him with a face of anger. He noticed her right away, but his face remained the same, indifferent. She marched up to him, stopped abruptly, and stared at him as he raised an eyebrow at her. They had a brief stare down, but she failed to keep a serious face as a smile began to creep in. He allowed his mask to fall and wrapped his arms around her small frame, squeezing her tightly. She slowly put her arms around him, and this is when she realized how big he really was. Her hands had difficulty reaching one another on his back as she normally would cling them together when embracing someone. This caused an odd knot to appear in her gut, giving her a strange feeling that she had never experienced before. However, she could not tell if it were a good or bad feeling. It felt as though it were equally both. He then lifted her off the ground and swung around in a small circle and pulled her against him as if he were holding a stuffed animal. She still had her hands around him but kept her face hidden. He stopped instantly and grew rigid. The rise and fall of his chest had ceased. He stiffly released her. When she found her footing, she peered up to a face that she had never seen before. It was not one that she was familiar with and did not know how to respond to it. He vaguely smiled, then it grew into what Anne thought was anger or fear. He then slithered around her, pushed his way through the crowd, and disappeared. Anne stood there dumbfounded and confused.
Hey, Anne!
Violet yelled over the crowd. She came from the southern wing of the school. Anne followed Violet out to the car, occasionally looking back over her shoulder, but there was no trace of him. Section 3. The Quad. A month had passed. Sebastian had asked Astrid out, to which she gladly accepted. She was indeed a lot like Anne, but much more passionate when it came to her reactions, and nothing short of clumsy. Astrid was constantly dropping her pencils or tripping over things, but she always managed to catch herself. Anne noticed right away that Astrid had the same sense of humor as her, which immediately sparked her interest. But Anne was still resentful towards Astrid. Anne had to remind herself fairly often it was not Astrid's fault, as she had no knowledge of Anne's feelings for Sebastian, and to be kind. Anne, however, decided not to inform Astrid of even briefly dating him. Since Astrid and Sebastian started dating, Anne thought it would be alright to get to know Fat a little better and see what kind of person he really was and if he truly felt something for Anne. She finally gave in and gave Fat her phone number. They chatted quite often, and she found him to be humorous and clever. What Anne thought was funny was the fact that Fat was a completely different person when Sebastian was not around. He was not obnoxious, but calmer and more collected, which intrigued Anne, urging her to find out more about this person. Soon enough, by late September, the four of them began hanging out at Fat's house. He and his mom lived in his grandmother's house. It was conveniently located past the school and down one of the back roads where it became more of a rural area. Fat had only lived in Campbell County right over a year before Anne met him. He had moved from one of the larger surrounding cities. The four of them came up with the group name of the Quad. The Quad would walk the roads in the neighborhood where Fat lived. It was far enough in the woods where the roads became less smooth and lost their white lines in the center of the path and the more debris from the broken-up road lying about. They had found an area not far from his house where a long metal cable bore a yellow sign on the center of it displaying "No trespassing." Of course, like all young folk do, they went right in to investigate the area. Past the cable and sign was a path that bore vehicle tracks in the dirt going straight ahead. The trees were thick in this area and was absent of sunlight. This made the tracks disappear into the darkness that none of them had yet desired to venture to find out more about where these tracks led. There was no mailbox, so they assumed it was not a driveway, but yet it was difficult to tell in these areas. To their left was a massive hayfield that stretched nearly 150 yards, both vertically and horizontally. The field was surrounded by trees, so once they made it past the cable, they would not be seen by someone unless someone ventured past the cable as well. Once they made it across the field, there was another set of trees lining the skirts on the north side that they wanted to investigate. The trees were not as nearly as thick, which allowed sun to shine through and appearing as if they were almost in a fairy tale dream. The moss was thick on the trees and the foliage was rich, along with mushrooms sprouting from fallen logs and other dead trees that stood brittle. As they made their way further north, they noticed the trees began to thin and grew farther apart. When they reached the outskirts of the woods, they came to an overlook on top of rock slabs that jutted over a crystal blue lake. Down further and closer to the water was a mixture of sand, rock, and shells from the sea critters. How marvelous the sights were! Incredible to gaze upon the crystal sheets glistening in the sun. They spent most of their days together at the lake and would normally not come home until well after dark. Quad would all have a sleepover at Fat's house since his grandmother had taken to her summer home out of state and his mom was not home often. However, during their nightly strolls to the lake, each set of couples had a located spot that they called their own. Astrid and Sebastian found a place they preferred that was out in the open, sitting upon a rock that stood 20 feet above the water. This made it easy to watch the stars come out at night once the sun had set. Fat and Anne had taken a liking to an area within the woods that was essentially a drop-off. It was similar to Astrid and Sebastian's, but they had trees surrounding them. They could not watch the sky above them, but when peering ahead, they could see the stars shining from here. Below, they gazed upon the slate of black glass reflecting the giant orb in the sky, rippling in the currents as the autumn's chilly air shrouding them in blankets of serenity. Section 4. And so it begins. One particular night, the Quad made their way to their spots at the lake. As romantic as the atmosphere was, something shifted in the air that night. Anne and Fat were not dating, but they had become best friends. She had grown comfortable around him, which was significant to her. Most of all the awkwardness had washed away from their first encounters with one another and replaced with a lightness that one always strives to have. Anne had learned that her and Fat also had a lot in common. The two sat close together on the rock, overlooking the sheets of liquid glass rippling below. Through the darkness she peered at the vividly blue eyes illuminated by the moon. The eyes that stared at her often. Fat had not yet made any obvious moves, and Anne was all right with that. After a long silence, he let out a low sigh as he kept his eyes on the waters below. Since he did not engage in continuing on, she took it upon herself to ask him what was wrong. "I like you, Anne," he finally said, his face thoughtful and solemn. He began kicking his feet that dangled over the edge, causing a fairly large rock and several small pebbles to detach and fall into the water, creating little ringlets in the current. "I like you too," she responded without thinking. She did like him, but did she like him in the way that he was referring to? It felt right, but something was off. The same strangeness that came with it since the beginning always lingered in the back of her mind to present itself when she would allow her guard to be let down. A light breeze blew in, giving the air a nip enough to cause them to shiver, blowing around the autumn leaves that had recently departed from their tree, causing them to land sporadically alongside them and on the water. The occasional stray bat would flutter about, then disappear back into the trees. When Anne took her eyes off the lake, he was already staring at her intently. A shiver made its way down her spine despite the chilly breeze. As she stared back, strange sensations washed over her. Sound seemed to cease, and all time around them would slow. It's as if the world around them went still, but it somehow did not feel like a good feeling. How is this not a good feeling? Isn't this what love feels like? There was something still off about it that she could not quite place. It was not bad, or was it? She thought about this for a moment while she continued to stare into his unblinking eyes. Sensations of chills, tingling at her fingertips, and the hair on the nape of her neck stood, and her throat felt tight. It was a mixture of positive and negative. Never knew that she craved it so much in her life. He wrapped both arms around her and held her tightly. His arms covered over half of her torso, and the warmth settled into her bones, making her want to collapse into him. Her body felt like static, the absence of something. Something was there, but it was incomplete. She did not understand this. How can something that feels so right also feel so wrong? He pulled her away from him, both of his hands covering her shoulders. He then took hold of her face to coax her to come closer to him. He pulled her close to his face and held her there, surveying her, then breathed, "Anne, I love you." His eyes sharp and searching. She mouthed, but nothing more. Holding her head firmly now, she could hear her hair that had gotten in between his fingers and her face, making a scratching sound as his grip tightened. Her eyes grew wide, and he released her. "You're so beautiful, Anne. You really are." He was such an odd creature. The way he stared at her, the way the atmosphere wrapped around their auras, the way the silence fell over them and hushed their souls. What an unusual feeling it was to have someone invading your insides with such a touchless sensations. There was something about the boy. There was something different about him, but she was not sure she could quite place it. Whatever it was, it terrified her, but yet it intrigued her enough to not shy away from it. "Will you go out with me?" Considering she was still trying to heal from her small letdown from over the summer, she asked herself if perhaps maybe it was too soon, and this was why it felt wrong. However, as soon as she questioned it, it was clear to her that this was not the case. It had nothing to do with the boy across the woods likely kissing the other girl. Completely separate feelings and situations. Different worlds, it seemed. She noticed that the absence of sound would come when he was around, but this never happened any other time. However, it was not constant. This did not resurface every single time she was with him, but it did creep up every so often enough to burden her and make her almost fear him. She considered that this was probably being fearful of change and the fact that she wanted to move onto something more in her life, and her heart maybe was just not ready yet. No, that's not it either. None of this fit the puzzle. It simply did not fit. It has nothing to do with a broken heart. This was a whole new level of invasion. But what did it mean? Any of it, for that matter. Sometimes it was soothing to hear the low humming when the rest of the world was bustling about. He seemed like a genuine guy. Despite all the bad feelings he brought with him in his presence, she had made her choice. She was concerned, but the urge to do this was higher than the concern of alert that arose when it decided to present itself. "Yes," He wrapped his heavy arms around her, squeezing her tightly. Though startled by his sudden, swift grasp, she relaxed and settled into his arms snugly, listening to the sound of his breathing. He rubbed her back with one hand and the other hand held behind her head, keeping her close. He then moved to her hair, feeling its glossy silken texture of dark brown threads flowing down her jacket, then returned his hand to her back again. She closed her eyes, allowing the intoxicating moment to wash over her, cleansing her of all wrong while they remained where they were, inside themselves. He snuggled his face against the top of her head. As he peered down at her, her eyes soft, and a faint smile spread across his face, preceding a barely audible sigh of content. "I do love you, Anne. I promise not to hurt you." He dropped his hand when he saw her expression fall into sadness. "How can you be so sure? You don't know me." "I know you enough to know that you're all I want," he went on, "and I would never hurt you." She looked back at him as he placed his hand on hers that was perched on the rock they sat upon. He moved close to her face. "I promise." Section 5. The New Family Edition. Like all those in life know, when things begin to go well is when the bad will rear its ugly head and put an end to the smooth sailing. Anne now faced Sebastian every single day with a heavy heart, and not just at school, but her home too, which was now his. Department of Child Services had gotten involved with a situation pertaining to him, Paula, and Paula's boyfriend. Sebastian felt after an event happened while Paula's boyfriend was drunk that his mom cared little for him, and thus he was now moved into Anne's home. Anne's mother, Ruth, who loved Sebastian, took him with open arms. What Anne did not understand about the situation was, why here? Sebastian was dating Astrid, so why not stay with her instead? She figured she would leave these questions for another time while Sebastian settled himself in downstairs in the spare bedroom, which Vince, Anne's father, used to use as a computer room and a room for his die-cast cars. The downstairs bedroom was a deep gray and the walls were lined with metal shelves made by Vince himself, who was a sheet metal fabricator, boring a plethora of die-cast cars. The computer made its way upstairs into her parents' room, where he could still be on it, but not quite as often or late as he wanted now. Sebastian moved in his display swords, books, and other items. There was already a spare TV down there, so he chose this one over his smaller one that he had left back at his mom's house. Fat and Astrid immediately spoke of their disagreements with the two living together. She came home from school one day and his things were already there, and he was in his evening attire. A ragged stained t-shirt with a pair of basketball shorts with his feet kicked back on the love seat that was left downstairs reading a book. She had wondered why he was not at school. According to Ruth, she had power of attorney over him, but this was temporary. For how long? Anne wondered. Fat and Astrid felt shaded and violated by the actions taken. Anne told them she had no say in the situation, but whether they believed her or not was another story. There was no use beating a dead horse by trying to convince them otherwise in order to appease their feelings when hers were also on the line. Section 6. Ready or Not. Several weeks later, after the initial shock for everyone blew over, things steadily made their way back to normal, or as normal as it could be. The quad went on double dates. Dim orange letters on the front of the building stated "The Movies." The building was old. It was large enough to fit 2 separate movie rooms in, as well as a small concession stand. The Movies was essentially a hole in the wall, but it was certainly everyone's favorite place to go. Not only that, but no one could compare the dollar ticket prices. The food prices, however, were just as high as any other movie joint. The entrance was 2 sets of double doors, which weren't even as new as the high schools. This really said something. Walking in, the lobby was exceptionally dim compared to the lights above only the concession stand. The floor was a checkered pattern, normally boring large amounts of dirt, wrappers, and stray popcorn littered across the linoleum. The bathrooms were graffitied up with phone numbers, gossip, terrible illustrations of human privates, along with many names. Inside the theater itself, the floor was inclined at a 10-degree angle, if that. The dark red seats had stained fabric as well as the dark curtains that hung around the theater room. The seats that Anne always chose when she went with her dad seldom were the two seats in the far right-hand corner, furthest from the screen. On the floor, you could see that there were seats here before, but removed since then. She wondered each time she saw them what happened to have them removed and why they were never replaced. Tonight, rather than sitting in her usual seating, the four of them chose the front row on the right. They purchased a large popcorn and 2 large drinks to share amongst one another. During the movie, which Sebastian and Astrid were not watching, but swapping saliva, Anne was watching the movie intently. She had not paid much attention up until now. The movie was showing a mother in the hospital walking briskly through the halls, with her thin lips pressed into a firm line on the verge of frowning. The mother came to the room her little boy was in, who lay in bed hooked up to monitors and had IVs hooked in both arms. The boy was sleeping peacefully. The mother sat down in the chair next to her son, pulled her purse out, and then put it in her lap and found a tissue to dab her eyes with. "Anne," the voice beside her whispered softly. Anne turned to Fat, who had an eerily similar look that he had when his stare seemed to be trying to pull her in. He slowly lifted his hand and placed it gently on the back of her neck, nudging her towards him. When the heat of her breath reached his lips, his grip tightened and pushed her into him, with his lips firmly pressing on hers. But she did not return the same passion. She was confused. She had come to care for him, but the feelings she had for him were not those that she had felt before.
Is this love? What is this? It doesn't feel right. It feels wrong, but at the same time, this isn't the love described in books. What is this?
She remained frozen until his grip ceased. What Anne was experiencing was not black and white, but the untapped gray area between. This area in one's mind should always remain untouched. He pulled back from her and nervously noticed the expression on her face. Her face was not lit with delight or smitten. Her face showed confusion and fear, but in his mind, this did not add up.
Was she not ready? Did she not like it? Why is she looking at me like that? What is this unknown emotion she's spilling out before me with her eyes? I don't understand.
He vaguely smiled, then returned his sights back to the movie ahead. Though his eyes returned to the screen, he went deep within his mind to discuss with himself, while the reflection of the images flashed across the shine of his eyes, but remained unseen by them. Section 7. Journal Time. After they left the movies, Sebastian and Anne returned home, both going separate ways, one upstairs and one downstairs without a word. Anne went to her room immediately and shut the door behind her, locking it. She sat herself against the closet door, as she always did when she needed to think. She considered who she could talk to about this. First off, Sebastian was out of the question for this one, as those two were best friends, and she knew that there was not much she could say that he wouldn't likely be repeated. Astrid, Anne did not know her well enough to trust her with this sort of sensitive information, and she assumed that Astrid would end up relaying the information Anne confided in her to Sebastian. Again, a loop that Anne wanted to avoid. Ruth, her mother, was out of the question as well. Ruth's advice did not go far when it came to relationships. Violet would simply provide Anne with an answer she had learned too well and could mean many things depending on the subject, or the facial expression given when uttering the single word, "Rah." Vince, her father, was not someone that Anne felt comfortable discussing a subject pertaining to boys. To Anne's misfortune, she realized she had no one to talk to. Anne lowered her head and decided upon writing in her journal, something she had not done in nearly a year. She decided to finally pull it out and begin writing again, like she used to. Anne wrote for what felt like a good while until she noticed she had actually stopped and had been staring at the page with her pen on the paper while the ink spread in orderable directions before she quickly removed it with a sigh of frustration. The thoughts buzzed around chaotically in her head, but she was not able to quieten them down. enough to think clearly. Journal entry, October 7th, 2006.
Hey, it's been a while, hasn't it? Yesterday was Friday. I begged to go to the movies with Sebastian, Astrid, and Fat. We then went over to the movies around 7:20 p.m. or so. The boys belly bumped and rolled around on the asphalt. Then Astrid and I skipped to the movies, almost getting run over by a Jeep in the process. We got to the movies, ordered a combo, and drinks to go with it. When the movie started, we created a river of popcorn. I even found a piece in my shirt. LOL. Something else happened though. Fat kissed me. I don't know how to feel about it. It's different than any other person's kiss, which leads me to think I like him. But I also felt the bottom drop out of me. What does that mean?
Section 8. Separation. Anne thought on the subject for quite some time, but came up with no real solution that would not have its repercussions. Fat was more than she felt she could handle emotionally. Inside of him, he carried an aura that seemed to grip hers and would cling on to hers until their departure. She was left feeling exhausted, but within the same realm, once it ended, she craved for it to come again. When she thought of this, it made no sense to her how something smothering could be pleasing, but each time she pondered on the subject, she remained where she was, and with no progress made on the matter. His aura was not the only thing within him that he seemed to carry. There seemed to be an unknown within him that even he seemed to be unaware of. But she felt it even in her bones. She feared the unknown and its foreign presence that it brought along with it.
What kind of creature is this?
Anne wondered. There aren't real people out in the world like this, surely. These are fairy tales. They don't exist. When the thought reached her mind, she smirked and thought how silly it was. Her thoughts then wandered to what she referred to as the pull and how powerful it seemed. This reminded her of how an anglerfish would lure its prey in, as the unsuspecting fish would spot the light and would begin to be pulled in, but willingly by their own little fins that would swim their way to their own death. Anne faintly heard the TV in the next room to hers playing what sounded like MTV, which was nothing new for Bryce or Violet to be watching for hours on end. They were not that far along yet, but still.
Where do I see myself in a year? 2 years? 5 years? What about 10 years?
When she asked herself these questions, they never went far. She could only see herself as she was now, and everyone else around her just the same. It was almost as if she tried to look to the future and imagine what it would be like in different instances, that her mind would create a black cloud. Her sister, along with the others she had overheard talking about their futures, would speak of being with a certain person, having kids, buying a house, going to college, doing this and that. However, Anne could not see anything. It worried her, making her think that perhaps she was not going to live long, and this was why nothing was there to imagine, because she wouldn't be. Anne shook her head of these thoughts, realizing she was only going in a circle and still not answering any of the initial questions. Even these questions that branched out from the main ones remained unanswered, and this did not help at any rate. The phone in her hand was one of the duplicates in the house for the landline they had. The buttons, when activated, lit up neon orange. At this moment, as she stared at the idle phone, it intimidated her knowing what was to come, and it being all her doing, but she knew not what else she could do. Sebastian and Anne were not getting along and arguing, but what she was about to do, she knew, would only worsen their already shaky friendship, or what little friendship those two had left. Sebastian had become aggressive with Anne, and it only steadily escalated over time, but she could never say anything to her parents. She was afraid of what would happen and what he may do, as he was the one known for being spiteful. He knew no bounds when he felt a spiteful hair nip him in the ass. She decided and dialed Fat's number. He was the one who answered the phone. Anne could not recall what she said specifically, but once she had said it, he hung up. She stared at the phone that went idle again and allowed it to slip through her sweaty palms to the floor. She made her way over to the bed, curled up under the covers, and cried herself to sleep. Section 9. The Aftermath. The following morning at school, Anne went into first period sluggish and begrudgingly, knowing what she had to face today. She simply did not want to face or see Sebastian or Fat, though she rode with Sebastian in Violet's car. They spoke not a word to one another the whole ride to the high school. Anne made her way to her desk she chose several months ago when she first came to this class, sat down, and began slowly pulling out her materials from her bag. Sebastian was already in his sleep with his head down and had already fallen back asleep with his nose in the middle of the pages of his open math book. She peered over to him and wondered, but only for a moment, why he would even still sit by her when he was so rude to her. The teacher had not assigned seats. The thought did not linger long as Anne observed from the corner of her eye Fat walking in. He met eyes with her, immediately dropping them and sitting down in the seat in front of Sebastian. Fat plopped his book down on his desk. Anne noticed right away that Fat was wearing an army green jacket, which was completely unusual. He never wore jackets, and when he did, he would normally fold the sleeves up. Today the sleeves were down and covering part of his hands. He made it a point not to turn around and look in her direction, but kept his eyes straight ahead or down at his book. The guilt began to well within her gut, causing her to feel sick.
I'm sorry. I never intended to hurt you. I wish I could talk to you about this and make you understand. But I know those words are something I don't have. Nor do I even know where to begin explaining this to you, let alone anyone. Everyone would think I'm crazy. I feel like none of this makes sense, but perhaps one day it will. You're not like the others. There's something attached to you, and I fear what that something is. You're such a sweet guy, and you don't deserve someone like me bringing you down. I'm sorry, Fat. I really do care about you, but...
Her thought was broken when Fat leaned down to place one of his other books underneath in the cubby of his desk, when his jacket sleeve got caught on a screw sticking out of the desk. The sleeve was pulled up, displaying rows of dark red down his arm. She gasped. The skin near his wrist had seen the worst of the wounds. It was difficult to tell if there were several cuts close together, to the point of it appearing as one, or if he repeatedly cut over top of one another, causing it to be a bloody mess of flesh. Further down the arm, there were signs of aggression, but not quite to the point that the wrist had received. About halfway down his forearm, there was a cut that appeared more as if a jagged object had been dragged through the skin and tearing it. Small pieces of skin still hung from the jagged wound. Anne noticed one small piece that had already begun to turn black. Bruises surrounded the wounds, some boring light blue while others wore deep purple. The sleeve of his jacket jerked down over his arm when he peered up wide-eyed and looked at the boy, who told her with only his eyes that you did this. He glared at her another moment, then returned to the pages in his book, while he readjusted his shoulders and cracked his neck. Sebastian remained asleep during this series of events, and it was best that he did. Anne knew that he would have asked what happened, Fat would have told him and blamed her, then Sebastian would have made a scene. Anne looked away from Sebastian, who had already begun drooling on the pages of his book, and back to Fat, who was already staring at her. He furrowed his brow. "What?" Fat breathed in an exhausted tone. Then he turned back around to avoid further interaction. Anne laid her head down on her desk and allowed the tears to fall while she hid her face in shame. Journal entry, October 12th, 2006. I'm so depressed. Everyone is pissed at me. Fat cut himself because I broke up with him. God, I feel like shit. Sebastian is mad at me too and says I'm a GD bitch. He's been this way since I got with Fat and he got with Astrid. It doesn't make sense. I'm really wanting to give up. I don't care about any of them. So why am I crying? Why did Fat have to do that to himself? It broke my heart. There was no reason to take it that far.
I had to break up with him. I had to. There was nothing else I could do. He was doing something to me and I can't figure out what. God, Please help me and tell me what to do. Please.
Section 10. So, what is it? Days turned into weeks as Anne and Fat slowly began talking to one another again. Eventually, they got back on a schedule they had been on previously and spoke every day, along with the quad doing their usual. If the four of them were not at Fat's house, they were down at the lake, in the woods, or somewhere in between, and being the teenagers that they were. Like most teenagers, they had the most fun during their adventures when they received the thrill of trespassing on property that was normally absent of others. Anne was glad that she was back on decent terms with Fat. Not necessarily good, but it was decent, and she was fine with that. This gave her the opportunity to observe and try to understand exactly what he seemed to be doing to her without him being aware. Without showing his intentions and keeping that part of him hidden away from the naked eye and out of Anne's observations that she ensured she did not make known. Perhaps he knew that Anne was watching for cues and signs, but this changed nothing, it seemed. Anne thought quite some time about the pool, how he seemed to be the only person she had ever met with this type of characteristic, and the fact that this was not something consistent when in his presence. Keeping distance from him in this way made her think of how you could get in the pool with a shark, have a chance yourself being swallowed whole, or dangle your feet in and have a chance of a foot or a partial leg being eaten. The threat is still there, though it is not quite as devastating if something were to happen. Perhaps, anyway. Hey guys, so section 11 is optional to read, or listen to rather, as it's mainly pleasant memories, not necessarily tied into the main plot. So if you want to skip ahead, you're more than welcome to do so. Section 11. Let the games begin. During their stay at Fat's, the quad had quite a bit of child play going on within the walls when no adults were home, as kids do. Especially the boys, who were exuberant and enjoyed slandering one another with different insults that were fairly far-fetched, and to the point that of it not being all that believable. They not only shot insults and play at one another, but would physically assault each other, and one of their favorite activities was while the other party was asleep. From pouring water over their face, teabagging whether or not their mouth was open, place slugs in terrible areas, smear jelly or peanut butter in their hair, and so on. On a beautiful fall morning, Astrid woke early as she intended to join in on the fun. Anne, who was still covered up to her nose, with only her eyes and up visible, she lay awake staring out the window and watched the dawn light turn steadily brighter when she heard soft footsteps through the silence. Anne's eyes glanced to the door, where Astrid stood frozen with an expression of anxiety, mischief, and a hint of unbearable excitement that was on the verge of causing her to squeal. Astrid brought her hand into Anne's view, where a single egg rested in her palm. She gestured with one head nod towards Fat, who was still sleeping, but Anne could see Astrid biting the bottom of her lip in sweet anticipation. Anne peered over to the sleeping beast next to her and thought, what the hell, why not? Anne smiled at Astrid, to which it was returned but 100-fold. Anne nodded and slithered out from under the covers and ventured out of the splatter zone. Before Anne had moved to the area where she wanted to be, Astrid had already taken a running leap onto the bed where Fat lay snoring with heavy sighs. The hand holding the egg was held high and ready to release the missile onto the unsuspecting target. Astrid reared her arm back that held the egg, and rather than throwing the egg, her hand remained on it as she slapped the egg onto his face with full force. The shell cracked and exploded over his head, along with the bedding. Some of the goop splattered onto Astrid's glasses, causing her to fall backward off the bed. She still had the slick snot on her hands from the egg. She hit the ground with a hard thud and let out a Frantically kicking at the floor with her heels, she attempted to scoot herself away before being seen, and all the while whispering in panic, "Shit, shit, 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 shit." As clumsy as Astrid was, she still managed to grab the door frame with her clean hand, pulled herself off the floor like a child learning to walk, but with fear-induced speed, and bolted from the room. Anne heard distant squeals coming from the den where her and Sebastian normally stayed, followed by a shriek, a thud, and a guttural yell that was obvious it was due to sudden pain. Anne could see it in her mind, knowing exactly what Astrid had done was take a running leap onto Sebastian, who was likely lying on the couch, and landed on his manhood. Anne looked back in Fat's direction, who had not yet rose from the bed but still lay in a puddle of snot with his eyes closed, but his snoring had ceased. He slowly uncovered himself and careful to open one eye where the unknown substance had not reached, which was bloodshot and tired. Bringing his hand up, he touched his face gently. When he pulled his hand away and spread his fingers apart slowly, the yolk appeared as a film-like webbing in between his fingers. He grimaced, curling his lip as he let out a low sigh. Carefully getting himself out of bed and taking care not to touch anything with the vile hand, he stumbled to the bathroom without a word or glance at Anne. She heard the bathroom door shut with a thud and a thump here and there. The water switched on, and then the shower as he slid the metal ringlets. After several minutes of the shower turning on, Astrid made her way back into Fat's bedroom with a timid smile on her face. Astrid, as excitable as she was, shook her fist stiffly in front of her. In her signature exhausted yell, she asked,
Is he mad?
Astrid's reaction made Anne feel a stir of excitement welling in the pit of her stomach. It filled within Anne until it felt nearly unbearable for her not to burst out laughing.
I think so.
Anne laughed.
Oh my God, Anne!
Astrid shouted. She pointed to the pillow that the egg had splattered onto, and in the volume louder than the last, she yelled,
Oh my God, it looks like freaking jizz!
She grabbed the pillow and carried it off to the laundry room. Anne could still hear her laughing from the other end of the house. Anne was unsure if Fat was actually angry or not, but it was still a harmless joke. Anne considered an egg being slapped over the side of your face much better than being teabagged by another guy, in her opinion. Later that night, after sunset, they all ended up staying over at Fat's house once again. The quad had decided that they would make their way into the backyard where an old shed his grandmother had lost a key to years ago stood. Everything inside sat gathering dust and rot. The 2x3 windows, one on each side of the building, covered thickly in dusty muck and enough to where if they looked in, they could only make out shapes from within.
Hey dude, let's get in there.
Sebastian gestured to Fat, pointing up to the window that was about 8 feet up. Fat glanced up at the window, then made a stern face nodding to Sebastian in approval. He pounded his fist in his hand.
Let's do this, yo.
He growled deeply. Fat hoisted Sebastian onto his shoulders as Sebastian tried the windows. He was careful not to break anything. He piddled in the dark for a moment, using the light from one of the neighbors' back porches to see his fingers working on one of the window's latches. Anne wondered why there would be latches on both inside and the outside, but she was young enough to not think about that very far. Within a minute, there was a loud click through the dark, and he was able to shove the window up and open. Sebastian turned and looked at the others with an open-mouthed smile, giving a thumbs up, then turned back and pulled himself up the window. He drug himself through the frame of the window. As his feet disappeared, there was a loud crash and the groans of boards.
Ow!
There were several thuds and scratching sounds, followed by his head poking out, smiling. It's all good. Come on. He had somehow got caught on one of the shelves when he slid inside, but he had knocked over several yard tools and scattered them across the barn floor in the process. Fat held his hands out to Astrid, motioning for her to step on them to hoist her up. She climbed onto Fat and stood reaching for Sebastian's outstretched hand from the window. She grabbed his hand with both of hers and made a small jump off of Fat's shoulders, but made little progress towards the window, causing her body to slam against the side of the shed. Sebastian drug her the rest of the way up and through the window. This followed similar crashing when Sebastian ran alone as she screamed.
God, Sebastian, Jesus!
Fat peered at Anne and smiled at her, but she felt reluctant to go inside. She thought of all the spiders and the creepy crawlies that would be lurking amongst the long-forgotten tools inside those walls. Her imagination took the best of her when she had thought of all the different spiders that could be in there, from the brown recluse to the huntsman. They all terrified her all the same. Fat squatted down and pointed to his shoulders. Come on, up you go. He noticed how fearful she looked. He smiled and shook his head. Don't worry. I'm not going to let you fall and bust your damn noggin like Sebastian and Astrid. Anne hesitantly climbed onto his shoulders. He stood up, holding onto her calves, then she stood slowly trying to balance herself as he helped hold her body steady. Anne looked and noticed the window ledge had a small area where she could place her foot for support to get in. She peered down to Fat, who was already staring up at her with a smile on his face. She returned the smile, then focused on the target. Her fingers landed on the ledge of the window, peered back, down, and at him again. Hang on, okay? He nodded. Positioning her body, she squatted slightly, then flung herself from the feet up on the ledge in the window when she heard a terribly bone-chilling ripping sound. Anne blushed. There was a cool breeze blowing tonight, and it blew right on the area that alerted her right away that the ripping sound came from her pants, and none other than her ass. Her eyes and mouth opened wide with embarrassment as she glanced down to Fat, whose eyes met hers, then made their way to the ground after they widened, knowing that she had seen, he had also seen. Anne shoved herself the rest of the way in through the window and her ass as far away from his face as possible. Astrid and Sebastian were in the far corner examining some of the old lawn equipment that hung from the walls of the barn on large rusty hooks. To their left was a shattered mirror that lay on the ground and reflected the moonlight, scattering a dull glow of light every which way within, enough to display the contents around them. Anne, however, took little notice of most of it, as she was more concerned about her cheeks showing. Suddenly, a loud thud on the wall from the open window rattled the barn, causing dust to flutter and fall. Several tools rattled on their hook and wavered slightly. They all turned and saw Fat's head come through the window, then his shoulders, and got stuck at his midsection. He grasped the board beneath and pulled hard, his face strained as he wriggled himself through the opening, then proceeded to fall headfirst to the floor. He caught himself in time, though. The other three stared silently at him as he lay on the floor unmoving. They grew quiet and listened. Fat let out a groan, followed by an "oof" when he got to his feet as he shook the dirt from his hair. Anne rushed to him. Are you all right? Yeah, I think so. After Sebastian and Anne heard he was fine, they went back to checking out the odd contraptions hanging on the walls. Anne motioned Fat to come close. Please tell me you didn't see my ass, she whispered hopefully. She leaned away from his ear, but he remained where he was a moment before leaning back up. She understood from his silence. Her cheeks flooded red. Section 12. Broken Hearts in the Halls. Monday arrived all too soon. Fat and Anne were walking through the hall together to third period when he stopped her before she stepped into class. Hey, he said often. It was almost breathed. It seemed as if he were letting off pressure from something building up, and it was relieving just to say it. She turned to him. He stared at her long hair flowing over her red jacket hood, her arms cradling her books, and her hands, with their long slender fingers barely visible outside the jacket sleeves, curled around her books. Her eyes seemed to always have so much to say. He disconnected from the feeling before she were to notice. A strong urge to speak of his ailments surfaced in him, to speak to the murderer about their murder. Making his abrupt decision, he grabbed her and held her tightly as he smelled the soft scent of her hair, then whispered in her ear, I'm sorry I ever loved you. Anne remained silent but placed her head on his chest and stared at the wall with her heart sinking into the pit of her stomach. She felt shame for what she had done, but she was still struggling with her feelings for the boy who lived with her now, who cared nothing for her. However, when she thought of this, it did not feel right. It did not feel like it was completely true, but more of an excuse more than anything. The puzzle piece, though similar to the shape needed, still did not fit.